Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to review a book entitled The Kingdom Conspiracy by Scot McKnight. And we have here with us Pastor Mike Hauntz of Pleasant View Bible Church, who is here to share with us some of the contents of the book and some of the insights he's gained from the book. Mike, welcome.
Hi, Herb.
Well, Kingdom Conspiracy. What's the basic thesis of this book?
So, if you read the Gospels, and you particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus talks about kingdom a lot. Several of his parables begin with the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is like. Jesus makes reference to the kingdom as having arrived, it's at hand, people are to repent because of it. And so he says a lot about kingdom, and consequently, a lot of pastors, theologians, pew sitters will use that term kingdom, and they'll talk about ministry as being kingdom work, or they'll talk about ideas as being a kingdom ideal or such. But few people define kingdom, and so the term gets thrown around all the time in classroom settings, in church sermons and such, but oftentimes few people define it. And so his goal in the book is to define, what do we mean by kingdom? What did Jesus likely mean by kingdom? And then maybe the bigger point is, after we understand what Jesus meant by kingdom and what his audience would have understood kingdom to mean, then what can we extrapolate out of that in our attempt to define what is kingdom mission and what is kingdom work? So,
okay. Well, what are some of the issues that he covers, or maybe we can get at this as by how does he divide the book up into chapters or sections, and then in the process, what are some of the issues that he talks about or covers?
So he begins the book by describing the differences between how the older generation of Christians would use the term kingdom typically, primarily as that which relates to someone being saved, becoming a Christ follower, and then he contrasts that with how younger generational Christians, millennials and such, tend to use the term, and for them they tend to use the term to refer to social justice issues, and a kingdom ministry is helping the poor or doing various social justice type things. So he shows the contrast between the thinking there, and then from there he kind of says, who's right, or is it somewhere in the middle? And so he looks scripturally, starting in the Old Testament, he traces that theme of kingdom throughout the Old Testament, starting all the way back in the Garden of Eden with Adam as a king-like figure, one who would rule over God's creation. And then, maybe a second stage would be the nation of Israel as God's kingdom of priests who would rule over God's creation and represent God on this earth. Then maybe the third stage would be David as an ideal king, and his descendants would rule in his place. And so he tries to understand kingdom through the Old Testament mindset, setting it up then for Jesus as the ultimate Davidic king and the ultimate representative of God who would rule over God's creation. So he traces that theme. Some other important themes then that he looks at is kingdom as a people, and the element of kingdom not as this hypothetical or ethereal or conceptual thing, but kingdom was always a group of people under the rule of a king within a jurisdiction or a land under a particular law. And so, the kingdom as people, he looks at, and then, kingdom mission, then he gets into some chapters talking about what is kingdom mission if we accept some of those earlier premises about kingdom that he tries to lay out. What are the implications of kingdom mission? If I recall, he ends more or less looking at the king of the kingdom, and with the premise that every king is going to shape the kingdom over which he rules. If a king is a good king, if his character is a certain way, if his value system is a certain set of values, that will ultimately shape the kingdom and kingdom life over whichever kingdom that king is ruling over. And so what are the implications of that for Christians? So that's sort of a walk through the book's topics.
Okay. All right. What caused you to want to read this book?
Well, as a pastor, I try to think ahead. What's my next sermon series going to be, and sort of what grabs my heart. And for a while I was kind of struggling with where I wanted to go next. And I don't remember exactly what got me thinking about this, but as I was kind of going through different ideas and topics, and for several weeks nothing was grabbing me, I started thinking about Jesus' kingdom parables, and what are the implications of that? Particularly, there was, in the parable of the sower, Jesus specifically referred to the secrets of the kingdom. And that line sort of jumped off the pages at me as I was reading the secrets of the kingdom, and kind of thinking about the fact that, Jesus wants to reorient his listeners' idea of what they think kingdom is all about. That in essence, he's come to reveal the secrets for those who have ears to hear, sort of the point of the parable of the sower. Those who are really listening will catch what kingdom is all about. And so that got me kind of asking that question, well, what is kingdom, and how did they understand it, and how were they wrong, and what is Jesus trying to say, and to what degree maybe do we miss that? In the course of that, then I was sharing that with a pastor friend of mine who's actually studying under Scot McKnight in the Chicago area, and I just happened to ask him as we were talking about where I was going upcoming. I said, do you know any good books on the kingdom that tries to define it or that kind of lays that out? And he got up and he went into the next room and came back with this book, Kingdom Conspiracy, and said, here's my gift to you. So that's why I started reading it, and I really was glad he gave it to me. It really helped shape my thinking as I proceeded through that sermon series.
Okay. Well, in some ways you may have already touched on this, but let me go ahead and ask what one or two things stand out as being extremely insightful as you think back, and having read this book. What one or two things does Scott bring out that was extremely insightful that you may have said, oh, I didn't think of it that way, or something along those lines?
Well, from the very beginning, as I mentioned, he starts out contrasting the typical, he refers to them as the pleated pants folks, referring to the traditional-minded church people, and how they tended to view kingdom, and thus how they used the term in preaching and teaching. And then his second chapter was on what he refers to as the skinny jeans folks, or the millennial generation, and how they used that term primarily with doing good things, helping the oppressed in any number of categories of oppressed peoples. And he would say, though he wouldn't land on either one of those two groups, he would be critical of that second category, in that he would say, it's almost as though they're comfortable throwing that term kingdom on anything as long as it's a good thing. So, volunteering in Africa to dig wells with a totally secular group, they'll call that kingdom work because it's doing a good thing. Some people even today, he quoted from, I don't remember who it was, but their whole understanding of kingdom is basically anything and everything we do. And so, if I'm talking to my mom on the phone, that's kingdom work. If I'm mowing my lawn, that's kingdom work. And so on the one hand, I felt it was very helpful to be exposed to sort of the broad spectrum of opinions and attitudes on kingdom, and sort of force me to think that through and try to land somewhere on that spectrum. Along those same lines, he talked about the controversy of, is the kingdom and the church one and the same today? And he will readily admit that the majority of scholars would say no, and they would try to distinguish between the church today and the expression of kingdom today, and he would take the opposite. He would say he believes that for all intents and purposes, practically speaking, they are one and the same. The church today is the expression of the kingdom. If we understand kingdom as a people under the rule of a king within a jurisdiction or within a land under a law, then the church is essentially what we're talking about when we talk about the already not yet expression of kingdom in its present form. And so because of that, he would say whenever we're going to talk about kingdom mission, it has to in some way tie back to the church. It has to in some way tie back to helping people reorient their lives under the authority of King Jesus, in some sense becoming a follower of his. And while that doesn't preclude us from doing good things in the public sphere for the sake of being good people, digging wells in Africa, he would say that's not kingdom work. That's good works. That's not kingdom work if it's not tied in some way to the church. And so I thought that was an important aspect of the book to think through and to consider whether you agree exactly with where he lands or not. I felt like he helped you think that issue through. There was one other issue that I found particularly thought-provoking, and it comes out of the whole already but not yet concept of kingdom, something I've already been familiar with and embraced intellectually myself. But then thinking that through, what the implications are for church ministry, if we accept church is kingdom in its present form. He talked about, as you look to the future, to the not yet aspect of kingdom, one of the things that we anticipate is people living side by side in harmony, in brotherhood, under the authority of Jesus, loving each other, living with each other, serving each other, being blessed by each other. And there's sort of this perfect family element, kingdom as a people. That's one of the things we long for. Well, then bringing that back to the already expression of kingdom, what do we see in the church? Well, we should see people striving for that. We should see people wanting that, embracing that, trying to love each other, trying to live with each other, trying to serve each other. Of course, because it's the not yet, we never see that perfectly. And so the temptation is, as we associate ourselves with the church and we see it in its imperfect form, is to, one, become critical and therefore just pull away. I don't need the church. Which I don't remember if he said this as this distinctly, but he would say that's one of the things that maybe the younger generation needs to be aware of or beware of, is their tendency to minimize church, to minimize it as it's almost like, well, you're either going to be a kingdom person or a church person, and almost to minimize church and maximize kingdom. And he would say you can't. Those are one and the same, and so you can't minimize the one and think that you're going to promote the other. And so just thinking through the implications of a not yet church as kingdom, what do we see when we have a small group and 3 of the members are excited about it and they're willing to read ahead of time and come and share, and others will sit in that group like a bump on a log, won't say anything, and you get frustrated, and you want to see this be a community of people intersharing with each other, and some people don't want to open up. Or you go to a church and there's cliques, and people aren't very welcoming, and so those things happen. And I think he would argue, if we're kingdom people, that should bother us, and rather than just being critical of it, we should see it as our responsibility to try to do something about it. It's not enough to just criticize your church and say they're not friendly enough. Well, you make it more friendly. You go out of your way to be a welcoming person. You go out of your way to help other people learn how to be a welcoming person, and recognize that we're all working imperfectly towards something that will only happen one day when Jesus literally comes to this earth and sits as king. So I thought those were the 2 most insightful practical elements from the book.
Okay. If Scott were here, if Scott McKnight were here, and you had the opportunity to ask him a question because you wish he had covered such and such in his book, what might that question or issue be?
It wouldn't be an issue that he didn't cover in the book, but that whole issue of where good works in the public sector, social justice issues, his understanding of how that relates to kingdom mission. He clearly touches on it, and the issue's probably with me, not fully understanding him, but that was an issue that he whetted my appetite for right from the beginning, and the whole way through I was looking for it, and at times he clearly comes back and addresses it, and I think attempts to land and express, kind of where he understands that balance to be. But for whatever reason, I'd go back and reread things, and I still feel a little bit like I'm not sure I could articulate his view of that, and thus I'm still not sure if I agree with him or disagree. So if he were here and I had the chance to talk to him, I'd want to press him more on that and listen to him and maybe ask him to explain some things that he said a little more clearly, or at least for someone like me to really understand what he was trying to say.
Okay. Are there other books that come to mind that are like this, or is this like a standalone, is one and only? What other type of books might complement this Kingdom Conspiracy book?
In preparation for this sermon series that I did try to look into other books that might also be helpful. There's any number of books that have kingdom in the title or that attempt to look at something related to kingdom. There are some books that I did purchase or borrowed from friends or had on my shelf that I pulled off that specifically focused in on the topic of kingdom, either from a theological perspective or looking, kind of walking through the scriptures and that theme of kingdom. This one clearly stood out to me as more practical, more interesting. Some of the others felt a little more theoretical and a little less relevant on a practical level to, how am I going to take some things and convey them to people in the pews to where they leave saying, oh, I really care about those distinctions. And I think, too, one of the things that I liked about this book is so often when you talk about, in theological circles, when you talk about the topic of kingdom as it relates to now, you typically get pushed into where you're a dispensationalist, you're a covenant theologian, or you're one of those couple in between who kind of takes that both and, whether it's progressive dispensationalists or something else. And so a lot of books or articles, I think, approach the topic through that lens. This didn't seem to do that to me. I mean, you almost had to really look hard to even know where he lands on that topic. There was one statement he made that makes me think I know where he lands on that, but he clearly didn't write it from a system, the lens of, well, from this system, here's how we define it, and here's why this system's wrong. I feel like people on any side of that equation, any point in that spectrum, could read this and not feel like their position was being attacked. This person's just trying to look at the Bible and what it says about kingdom, and he's not pushing a theological agenda. I didn't feel that way, so I thought this book stood out from some others in that sense.
Okay. Well, Mike, thank you. Thank you so very much for sharing with us this book by Scot McKnight, Kingdom Conspiracy. And thank you for joining us. And I trust that Mike's review of this book and some of the insights that he was able to glean from the book may spur you on to perhaps purchase it, read it, and maybe do a sermon series on the kingdom of God. In the meantime, I trust that you may walk with our King and that you will be a blessing for him. Thank you.